Hello, everybody. It is 12:30 on Central Time, and it's February 20th, and we're going to talk about Texas this past week. Um, which, if you've been watching the news, if you've been listening to any of this stuff, you might be tired of hearing about Texas at this point, especially if you're in Texas, like I am. And it's all that's on every single news station everywhere is, oh my goodness, Texas and Texas storm and Texas power outage and water failures and food shortages and all those sorts of fun things. And if you're living it like I am, um, you're kind of like, all right, I'm done. Right? When is this over? When do we move on? But what I want to talk about today is a little bit about Texas. I'm not going to go into every detail of what happened and why it happened and all of that sort of thing. I think there's some investigation that needs to happen. A lot of people want to put all the blame on wind turbines or put all the blame on natural gas or put all the blame on climate change. And I think there's some combination of factors. In fact, I know this is definitely not any one factor that is causing this to happen. So I don't want it to be this thing where we say, "Oh, it's this one thing, it's that one thing." I want the investigations to happen. Where were the faults in our system? What can we improve? But I have some concerns about how this crisis is being used. Now, I think it's really important to point out when emergencies, disasters, crises like this happen. Um, I would be very, very careful about suggesting that they could be um, not simply coincidence or that they could have been caused intentionally. I wouldn't want to say that. I do think, I do know that people like Rahm Emanuel, we hear from him. Rahm Emanuel, is connected to people like Obama and the Clintons and all of them. And his quote, never let a good crisis go to waste. Now, I know that I don't remember the exact word for word quote because there's different versions of the quote that float around, but it's essentially the idea that when a crisis occurs, especially if you can kind of foresee the crisis and say, hey, this might be a crisis, how can we exploit this to achieve our goals? And that's what I think is happening here. Not that somebody somehow caused the storm. There were some conspiracy theories out there that somebody caused the storm somehow, that like government weather control research. I don't think any weather control research that's being done is anywhere near able to do something like that. Um, but can opportunistic elites take advantage of a weather crisis, such as what we're seeing? That I do think is possible. So, we take a look at what happened in Texas, and you can see how they exploit the crisis by the way that they spin it. So you're going to see people spin it in whatever different political direction that benefits them. You're going to see people talk about how this is why we can't have green energy. This is why we can't have wind turbines or solar panels, or we can't rely on them. Others will say this is why we need more green energy because this is clearly climate change or whatever. Um, but what the most concerning rhetoric that I'm hearing from this is we need to connect Texas to the national grid. Absolutely not. Okay, as a Texan, absolutely not. We are not connecting to the national grid. Do not go there. It's not a good idea. The There are three grids in the United States. There is a Western grid, an Eastern grid, and a Texas grid. Texas has its own grid. The Eastern and Western grids are connected to each other. They have connections. They're still separate grids. So if one goes down, the other can stay up. Um, Texas has its own grid, and we are not connected to the other grids. And so some people are blaming that for the Texas power outages, um, saying that if we'd been connected to the national grid, we would have been able to get power from other places. It's not exactly true. I've heard several people who know more about the grid and about electrical systems than I do explain that is not the case, and that we would still not have been able to get enough power to enough people. Um, joining the national grid is not the solution. There are weaknesses in our grid. There are systems that need to be updated, that need to be winterized, that need to be prepared, so that if we have crazy weather that is unexpected and unusual and hasn't happened in decades, we need to be prepared for that. And it's a hard thing to do because it's a hard thing to say, well, okay, you have this storm, this winter storm that's like a once or twice a century kind of thing. And now we're going to spend taxpayer dollars to winterize systems and blah, blah, blah. And that can become contentious in that sense. But I think there's a deeper lesson. I think there's going to be lots of investigations and research and all this stuff into the grid and what do we need to do with the grid and how does the grid need to change and are we too reliant on this thing or that thing and what can we do for our wind turbines and how can we make sure we have enough backup power, backup generations that we can bring online in those cases where something does fail. Can we store power? Is there some way for us to store extra power, some kind of battery system? All those things are going to be investigated. But I want to talk more about what you as an individual can do to prepare for something like this happening in your area. Now, if you're in Texas like me, um, and you went through some of this stuff and you dealt with power outages and loss of water, food shortages now, difficulty getting to getting more resources because of roads being bad. If you dealt with this, you know, you may have noticed where, what are the things that you wish you would have had, right? What are the things that you wish you had stocked up? Is it extra food so you wouldn't have to try to go to the grocery store, and then all the grocery stores are closed, so you can't do that anyway? Was it extra water for when the water shut off, or when you got a boil water notice and now you're having to boil water that you can drink it? Um, what are the things that you wish you'd had? Is it extra firewood or a way to heat your home if you don't have a fireplace? What are those things? I think it's really important that we ask those questions and that we prepare for the next crisis, whatever it may be. Because the next thing may not be a winter storm, it may be something else. But if we recognize those gaps and recognize those places where we're not prepared, we can do better and we can be prepared for things that we can't anticipate. And like I said in the description of this video, nobody could have seen this coming from the standpoint of we don't get weather like this in Texas. We just don't. The temperatures that we got, the ice and snow that we got, these things don't happen here. And even though we had forecasts that said, hey, there's snow and ice and cold coming, a lot of Texans, I think, were in denial about that because we just don't get this kind of weather here. And so nobody really understood what that was going to look like. And if you're from somewhere, if you're from an area that does get this kind of weather, that does get snow and ice, you're used to having the systems to prepare for it. This is the thing about Texas. Like you go to Minnesota and you get ice and snow and freezing temperatures, they have plows and they have salt trucks and they have systems for this. Their systems are winterized. So the amount of snow and ice and cold that we got would not be a problem for Minnesota. Minnesota knows how to deal with this. Same with Wisconsin or Ohio or anybody else. They know what to do with this. Um, And so if you're from one of those places and you saw the weather coming, you're like, oh man, that's really cold for Texas. But I've seen worse, right? But then all of a sudden the roads are shut down. You can't get anywhere. The power goes off. The water shuts off. You get a boil water notice. I know for my family, very thankful. I'm very, very thankful and very blessed that my husband and I were at my parents' house on Sunday afternoon. Not even necessarily in anticipation of the storm. It was actually in spite of the storm. We debated whether we were going to come to my parents' house. We usually come over on Sunday afternoons, and we were debating whether we were going to do it because they were like, "Oh man, the roads are bad. It's stormy." And I said, "You know what? Worst case scenario, we'll stay overnight." Well, it's now Saturday, and we've been at my parents' house since last Sunday, so it's almost been an entire week that we've been here. And I'm very glad that we were because my apartment lost power for a lot longer. Where I am right now, my parents' house, they lost power for about 8 hours on Monday. but otherwise have maintained power since then, which is great. But we did lose water on Wednesday, and that's been rough because you can store enough drinking water and enough water for like drinking and cooking and stuff. But the thing that you don't think about is flushing toilets. Okay, I'm just going to leave that there. I'm not going to necessarily go into too much more detail on that. But think about that. When you're thinking about how much water you need to store, consider that. So we've been without water since Wednesday, and actually the water is back on at my apartment. So my husband and I are going to be heading home tonight and be able to take showers and have water again, which is going to be great. But at least, I'm very thankful that my parents had enough drinking water stored up. So we were not without drinking water at any point. And we did end up melting snow to use for toilets, to be able to flush toilets. But otherwise, we've had enough water for drinking and washing our hands and things like that. So I think it is important to think through those preparations, make sure, again, like the firewood thing. When the power went out, we realized, at my parents' house, we realized we did not have enough firewood to keep us warm for any extended period of time. And so that's something that my parents are looking into going forward. Things like water storage, firewood storage, things like that, so that the next time this happens, it's not as big of it's not the same level of disaster that it was this time. And as it was, we were very, very blessed in that we didn't get hit as hard as many people. It didn't get as cold in here as it did in some places as far as in the house, because we were only without power for 8 hours. And so there were many people who got, icicles hanging from ceiling fans. Is what I saw, and all sorts of things like that. So we analyze what are the things we could learn from. But if you don't live in Texas, if you're not a Texan and you watch this happen and you think, I'm so glad that did not happen to me, I need you to realize that this can happen to you. Even if you're in a place that's winterized and you're thinking, oh, well, winter storms don't affect us. I'm not talking about winter storms. I'm saying there are so many disasters that can take down the electrical grid, our water systems, our supply chain. The grocery store shelves are empty here. They're just straight up empty. It's pretty crazy. If we didn't have food stored up, I would be very, very scared right now. I'm very scared for people who do not have food stored up. I know there's a lot of people who don't, and I'm worried for them because I don't know where they're going to get food. I know there's all these efforts being made to get food into the state and get food to people who need it, but if I did not have food stored up, I would be very, very scared right now. The thing is, this is not the end of the story. This is not uh, the big disaster. This isn't the big one. I honestly don't even think COVID was the big one. You think about how much COVID has changed everything, has changed our lives, has changed our economy, has changed the way we do everything, and how much harm this whole COVID thing has done to so many people, both the virus itself and the effects of lockdowns and mask mandates and school closures and all those sorts of things, the effects that those things have had. There's another thing coming. At least I think there might be. Now, again, I can't tell you, yes, this is what's going to happen. I never can. But if last year when I started doing these videos and I started talking about prepping and why you should prepare and why you should store food and water, if you listened and you stored food and water and you live in Texas and you were affected by all this, or you live in another place, other states, other places were affected by this as well, and you were able to stay in your home and not go out on the roads and not have to, elbow people in the store for food and water. If you were able to stay home and hunker down and stay warm and eat the food and drink the water that you had stored, you did better than a lot of people in this thing. So, a year ago, or last summer, I couldn't have told you, yes, there's going to be a blizzard in Texas, or I don't even know if you call it a blizzard, but there's going to be a severe winter storm in Texas that's going to knock out people's power and water. I couldn't have told you that. But what I could have told you is that storms happen, disasters happen, and disasters happen in places you don't expect. And that's what makes them disasters, honestly, is the lack of preparation because you don't expect it. Because you don't expect the big storm, because you don't expect the hurricane to hit here, because you don't expect whatever it is. You're not prepared, and that's what makes it a disaster. If every single family had enough food and water for 2 weeks, if every single family in America had 2 weeks worth of food and water stored up, most disasters would be minimal. There would still be cases where we had loss of life. There would still be problems that we would face, but we would have so much more breathing room when it came to things like our supply chain, and our ability to get resources to people and get assistance and aid to people. It would make such a huge difference in even in cases like hurricanes and earthquakes and whatever else you can think of. Just having 2 weeks of food and water makes such a huge difference, including in a grid down scenario. But I've been kind of dancing around it, but I really want to talk about what I think might be coming. Not this winter in the sense of in the next month or so that we still have winter, but this coming winter, as in fall and winter of 2021. You see, back in 2019, which seems like such a long time ago now, it's so crazy how long ago that was. Um, there was, in the fall of 2019, there was an event put on by the World Economic Forum. And so I have this is the website for the World Economic Forum. Just so you know, some background, they are an organization whose members include basically every billionaire elite person you can think of, especially Bill Gates. He's a major player. A lot of corporations are partners with this, international corporations, international groups. Um, and they have this website and they have all these articles, and they very much are pushing for this kind of globalist, semi socialist, or corporate, I would say corporatist in the sense of corporations are controlling things. They have this kind of, and they post all these articles that are very left as far as, like here are 6 ways you can beat air pollution. So ignoring the fact that China provides most of the air pollution that we have to deal with, here's ways you can produce air pollution. You can ride your bike, you can do all that sorts of thing. And they put out all these kinds of articles. Okay. But these are just that, because it's just kind of their public face as far as like this is their trying to say, hey, look, here's how we can, uh, you know, here's how we can make the economy better or help people or whatever. And it all sounds very good. It's all very newspeak. It's all very, they know how to word things. They know how to phrase things. They know how to frame things, to fit their goals. But they have these meetings and they have these planning sessions, right? So, first of all, before I get to that, you can go down here to the very bottom and there's all this stuff about them, but you can go to their partners and you can see everybody who is part of this organization, and it's alphabetized, and all these corporations, companies, things like that, like Alibaba is part of them, Apple. China is definitely very much involved in the World Economic Forum. They actually had their like annual conference recently, and President Xi was a speaker at their conference. And but if you go under B here, there's Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, right? So this is something that Bill Gates is definitely connected to in that sense. Um, and they're the ones who bring us the Great Reset. And so you talk about the Great Reset, and it sounds like a conspiracy theory, right? It sounds like this conspiracy theory about how you're going to like take over, or the corporations are going to like totally redo our economy and whatever and all this kind of stuff. But they literally have the Great Reset website here. Like, so when I talk about the Great Reset, I'm not talking about some conspiracy theory. This is not some kind of QAnon thing. This is literally They have a website, right? It's weforum.org/great-reset, right? All my links are in the description below. This is not some secret plan. It's public. They're telling you that they're going to do this. Bill Gates is telling you that you need to get used to the idea of fake meat, right? They're telling you these things. But they participate in these events. And here's an event that they participated in back in 2019. October 18th, 2019, they did a high-level pandemic exercise. Okay, now they have a statement here. Statement about nCoV, the novel coronavirus, and our pandemic exercise, where they basically say, no, we didn't know that the coronavirus was coming. We promise, pinky promise that we didn't know. But they had this exercise. So the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, World Economic Forum, Johns Hopkins, all major players. When we talked about the COVID response, these were all major players. It was a tabletop exercise where these participants, who were government, corporate, whoever, they played out how they would respond to a pandemic with a respiratory virus. They talked about wearing masks. They talked about using the media to convince people to comply with government orders based around this pandemic. They didn't plan it in the sense that they started the virus. I'm not suggesting that, but they planned it in the sense that they were ready for this. And it was a very, very short time frame. October of 2019, we actually have some evidence that COVID may have already been spreading at that time. Did they know? Did they know that COVID was a thing? It was in China. China is a major partner of this. Who suggested that they do a respiratory virus? Was it China? Did China say, "Hey, let's look at a respiratory virus for this"? Maybe. But this is very, very close to when we start hearing about COVID. And they're doing this exercise that's basically, how do we have a whole government, whole world, global response to a respiratory pandemic? So again, we go back to the idea of using a crisis and not letting it go to waste. And so they have this Event 201, and just a couple of months later, we have COVID, we have mask mandates, we have lockdowns, we have all this stuff. And it was predicted by Event 201. Again, centerforhealthsecurity.org. This is not some alt news platform. This is literally the organization that they partnered with. Okay, sponsored by Johns Hopkins, Bloomberg School of Public Health, right? Okay, you can see where this is. It's their Center for Health Security. So it's the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, centerforhealthsecurity.org, World Economic Forum, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They put on this Event 201 global pandemic exercise. There are videos. There's a highlight reel. There's different segments that you can watch, right? So this is important that you understand this, that this is a real thing that happened. This is not a secret. This is not some leaked government document. This is something that they advertised. They're not hiding this. Now they're going to make claims. They're going to claim, well, we didn't know COVID was going to happen. We just got lucky. We're just lucky that it was a respiratory illness that became the pandemic. We were just lucky. We didn't know it was coming. We certainly didn't influence it in any way. No, they were ready. They knew something was coming. Now, question is, did they do something, the whole lab leak thing, whatever? How much of a hand did they have in it? All of that, we can discuss all those things. But I just want to give you this, that we had Event 201, and a few months later, you had the pandemic, the COVID, the whatever. Now, this summer is Cyber Polygon. And they're going to do an event this summer with the World Economic Forum. Okay. World Economic Forum and this bi-zone cybersecurity thing. They have there's an annual Cyber Polygon event. These are cybersecurity events. Last year's event was about misinformation and uh, this whole idea of, you know, misinformation, the spread of information, and essentially censorship. They're not going to use the word censorship. They're going to talk about controlling the flow of information, right? That was last year. Okay, we can see how maybe that, that did predict something, right? If you had this cybersecurity event about controlling the flow of information in the face of misinformation, and then we have whatever that was with the 2020 election and going on and continuing to today. Now we have Concept 2021, and it's a Cyber Polygon event. It's a cybersecurity planning session, okay, where they're going to analyze a scenario. They're going to do a technical exercise, which is essentially like a tabletop. And this is event 201 was a tabletop exercise. So think of it like you're playing Dungeons and Dragons. You have a dungeon master. You have certain scenarios you have character sheets, right? They do something similar in the sense that they have, everybody's playing a role. You get little cards and envelopes and things that say, okay, here's your scenario. What are you going to do? What are your choices? And so they have those sorts of, it's that sort of thing, right? It's that idea of this tabletop exercise, almost a simulation in that sense. Now they're going to do one, not over a pandemic, not over a virus, but over a targeted supply chain attack. A targeted supply chain attack. What's our supply chain? Our supply chain is the raw materials that we need for the things that we use every day. So let's talk about food, right? The food supply chain. We have the food, production. We have our farms. We have our livestock, our ranches. Most of it is in the Midwest. The Midwestern states, the flyover states, are the majority of the food production, not just for the US, but like we produce a lot of food for the world. Then you have the transportation, because so much of our food production is centralized in one area, one geographic area. You have to distribute that, especially since, you think about major cities that have millions of people and no farmland, no real growing of food. You might have farmland in the surrounding area around that city, but you don't have any actual food production in the city. So you're transporting food. And this is what Texas just saw with our power outage and our road conditions and our water and all of that, is we saw a shutdown of the transportation. We saw that food could not get from where it was grown and processed to our grocery store shelves. Okay? So that's our supply chain. Now, in America, we have what's called a just-in-time delivery system. That means that grocery stores and restaurants and all of those kind of endpoint locations where you go and get food, they operate on about a 3-day supply. So in about 3 days, if they don't get deliveries for 3 days, their shelves go empty. And that's heightened if you have some kind of higher demand, such as people panic buying. We saw this with COVID. We saw store shelves empty because people panic bought, and there were disruptions in transportation because of COVID. In Texas, we saw it. There were disruptions in transportation because of ice and snow. And there was also increased demand because people were panic buying. People panicked. They didn't have supplies. They didn't know when the roads would be clear, when things would be back to normal, so they had to run out and buy things. You also have things where people's stuff in people's fridges goes bad or something like that, and they have to go because the power is out and they had to go buy new stuff. So you think about the supply chain, you have where the food is produced, how the food is transported, right? And then you have the endpoint distribution centers like grocery stores, restaurants, and so on. I want you to think about that. So, a targeted supply chain attack is what they're going to simulate this summer. They're going to analyze how they would respond to and mitigate a supply chain attack. Now, I'm not saying that this Cyber Polygon, this is a tabletop exercise, it's a theoretical planning exercise, but so was Event 201. They were both theoretical planning exercises. Event 201 was followed just a couple of months later, about 3 or 4 months later, depending on where you want to put the beginning of COVID. 3 or 4 months later, you have COVID. Now we have summer of 2021 is going to be this Concept 21 event. Okay. And they're going to be looking at a targeted supply chain attack. Now you go a couple months, I think it's June or July or something like that. Think about fall and winter of 2021. When is the worst time for the supply chain to go down? Winter. Because in the spring and summer and even early fall, you have food being grown, especially local farms, things like that. You have food being grown that's fresh, right? You can get fresh food from local farms. There's more options for things like foraging and hunting. You have fewer demands on power because you don't have to heat homes and things like that. And road conditions are good. So spring and summer, something goes wrong, we can relatively quickly get it back up and running. In winter, when you have those exacerbating factors, that it's harder for people to go out and get food from nature. It's harder for you don't have necessarily farms producing or having food ready to harvest at that time. You have the extra weather requirements, the extra demands on power from weather. You put all of that together, okay? And if you have an attack on the supply chain or on the grid in winter, that is deadly. That is one of the hardest times for people to survive something like that. So again, I don't know if we have enough data points to really see a pattern if we're looking at Event 201 and then the pandemic, and now we're looking at Concept 2021, this Cyber Polygon thing, and then this winter, this winter. And good afternoon to Euronymous Bosch, if I said that right. Welcome to the chat. If you look at that time frame, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that there's a possibility. And again, I can't guarantee anything. I can't tell you this will happen for sure 100%. I can't give you a date. I can't tell you exactly what it'll look like. But is there a potential that we could see a cybersecurity attack on our grid or on our supply chain this fall and winter? Maybe it's December of 2021, maybe it's January or February of 2022. Could what happened in Texas and in other places be a dry run, be a dress rehearsal? Think about it. If you're going to have a planning session in July, isn't it great to have some data points from a small localized attack on the supply chain? I'm not saying there was a cybersecurity attack on the Texas grid. Could there have been? Maybe. I don't know. Maybe we'll find that out in the investigations that are coming. But what if you're getting some data points from the Texas situation and you're using them in this planning exercise in the summer, and then this coming winter, we're potentially seeing the real deal? And a couple of further points that I think contribute to this. This is from January. Bill Gates is now the largest farmland owner in America. So in January, Bill Gates became the person in America who owns more farmland than anyone else. Okay? Why? He's not a farmer, right? He has no experience in food production. He's a computer engineer, and honestly, it's arguable how good he is even at that. Like, there's a lot of controversy about him stealing ideas from people and things like that. He's a computer programmer. Why does he own more farmland than anyone else? And then he's coming and telling you you need to eat fake meat, you need to eat plant-based meat, whatever. Okay, just think about that for a second. He's buying massive plots of land around the country. He has about 242,000 acres of farmland and 27,000 acres of other land across 19 states. He has a lot of holdings in Louisiana and Arkansas, which, wow, hold on. I didn't even see that before. That's going to tie into my next thing. I didn't even see that. So, fun story, right? So, farmland is the production side of our supply chain. You think about our supply chain, you have production and transportation and distribution, right? Production is where you produce it, you grow the food. Transportation is how you get it to market. And then market is your distribution, your grocery store, your restaurant. Think about your supply chain, okay? Bill Gates owns the source. He owns more of the farmland than anyone else in America. He owns the source of our food. If he wanted to, he could cripple our supply chain just with that. All he would have to do is stop, on all of his properties, stop them from producing food. That would cripple our supply chain. Now, I'm not saying he's going to do that. That would be weird. Why would he do that? Uranus Bush says computer man bad. Okay, and this, I don't want this to be like orange man bad, right? Like, we talk about, people talk about Trump and Trump derangement syndrome. But I want people to see what is happening here. I want people to see this guy and what he's doing, right? So he owns more farmland than anyone else. He owns the source of our supply chain. Now, he also owns the largest ownership stake at Canadian National Railway. Now, what does that have to do with anything? Canadian National Railway is it's a Canadian railroad, obviously, but it doesn't just go through Canada. So he basically, he owns a certain amount of the railway. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Trust also owns a certain percent. So it's not even just him. It's like he's, got this, between him and, his trust, his foundation trust, he owns a considerable sized piece of this railway. Enough to, enough of an ownership stake that he could potentially make decisions, right? He could make decisions. He's a controlling shareholder. Here's the map of Canadian National Railway. It's not just a Canadian company. And it's a Canadian company in the fact that's based in Canada, right? But look at where it goes. It goes all the way across Canada, and it goes all the way down the Mississippi. All the way down the Mississippi. Okay? We have Louisiana, right? We have Mississippi. We have Arkansas over here, Tennessee, right? The state lines on here, but yes, but that's where those states are. Okay? This is the distribution. Canadian Railway transports a lot of goods, including food, from your farmland, your Mississippi Valley, your Mississippi adjacent farmland, which is a significant portion of our food production, and ships it down up and down the Mississippi River, which then it gets to other railways and other transportation methods. But this is a significant portion of our transportation. So you take that. He owns the source of the food, right? And he owns a significant share of the transportation. And then Cyber Polygon, with the World Economic Forum and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, is going to look into the possibility of a targeted supply chain attack. Okay? Now, you could look at all this and say, you know what, this is all coincidence. Maybe he's just hedging his bets. Maybe he also thinks something could go wrong with supply chain and he's just using his money and resources to make sure that he and his family are protected. That's possible. But you put this together with just all of the, you know, press about Bill Gates as far as that makes him like where he's being consulted as though he's some kind of medical expert. He's being consulted about vaccines. He's so much a part of this vaccine distribution. And you look at there's a YouTube Kids show, and I'll have to find the link to it because I saw somebody else talking about it and they had a clip from it. But it was basically this kids cartoon on YouTube Kids that was saying what would happen if Bill Gates disappeared. And it was this whole thing where it was like essentially implied that like philanthropy and green energy and healthcare would all like grind to a halt without him. Like that somehow that we lost Bill Gates, that like the world would stop functioning or like it would make people be mean to each other or something like that. And it was just really bizarre to say, why are we teaching children that like Bill Gates is some kind of like benevolent leader, who's like making the world go round? And I look at this and I say, what, if we have COVID hit, right? COVID hits, and all of a sudden Bill Gates is the face of the response. He's talking, him and Fauci, right? You have Fauci, and then you have Bill Gates talking about vaccines, talking about masks, talking about all this stuff. Why Bill Gates? What does he have to do with anything? Yeah, he's got a lot of money. So do a lot of other people. He's not even actually the richest man in the world at this point, at least not with his personal net worth. Now you look at his trust and all of that, and so he probably is a lot wealthier than, on paper. But we watch this and I say, what occurs to me is that he's being set up to be the savior. They kind of did this with COVID, right? COVID hit, and here's Bill Gates with his vaccines and all his relief efforts, and he's going to come save the day. Now they're setting him up to be in control of a significant portion of the supply chain and to be involved with this this planning exercise for what would we do in the event of a supply chain cybersecurity attack. Are we setting him up, or is he being set up to be the person who comes to the rescue when the supply chain goes down? Is he being staged, as the person who has the power to save us all when the store shelves are empty? Again, I can't tell you this is going to happen. I can't tell you this is guaranteed. But what I can tell you is that it scares me. Because if these things aren't just isolated, whatever, if these things aren't just coincidences, if there is some kind of strategy here, we could be looking at a very dystopian future. Some people are like, well, we're already in the dystopia. The dystopia already happened. I don't think we're there yet. You go to that Massachusetts Undersecretary of Energy or whoever it was, who was in that conference call saying that we need to break the will of everyday people so that they'll won't heat their homes as much and that they'll, reduce their carbon footprint or whatever. And then you have Bill Gates telling us that it's okay to eat fake, or that we need to get used to eating fake meat. And then you had him, I just saw recently him like drinking water that had been made from human feces. Like he's out there with this message of, you need to cut back. You need to reduce your footprint. You need to eat and drink and do all this stuff to like conserve these limited resources. But I can still get on a jet. I can still eat a hamburger. I can still have multiple houses with all their lights on, and they're, I don't have to make those choices, but you do. Rules for thee, but not for me. That sort of thing. Is he being set up to be the glorious leader, right? To be the benevolent big brother who comes to save us when our system collapses? Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. Maybe he just has a vested interest in not putting himself at risk if things fall apart. Either way, if the latter is the case, if it's really just him hedging his bets and he thinks that everything's going to fall apart and he's preparing himself so that he's protected and he has all his resources, that still should be a sign to all of us that it's important to be prepared. So I say all of this to emphasize the necessity of being prepared for the collapse of the supply chain, whether it's a temporary problem with the supply chain or some kind of systemic collapse that lasts months or even years. Who knows? Who knows what that could look like? But if that is what's coming, or even if there's just a chance, even if it's just a small chance that that's what's coming, it is worth being prepared, especially because being prepared, you can be ready for something big like a supply chain collapse. That also can make you ready for something small, like a localized weather disaster, right? Which seems big right now, but if you think about a national supply chain collapse versus a localized weather issue, just think about, you get an unexpected ice storm and the roads are really dangerous and you don't want to go out on the road. If you have 2 weeks of food and water at home, you don't have to. You can stay home and you can wait for the roads to clear, and you don't have to be one of the people who are trying to brave the roads to get to the grocery store because they don't have enough food. Or even think about, like, that a weather event is coming, an ice storm, um, even just really heavy rains. If you live in an area like I do that gets flooding, think about, you got really heavy rains coming, the roads are going to be flooded. I don't want to drive out in the rain. Being prepared. Hurricanes, if you live in an area with hurricanes, think about when those events are coming, especially when people have forewarning and they know that there's like a hurricane or some other weather event coming. Think about what the grocery stores are like. Everybody flooding to the grocery stores, stocking up on bottled water. The shelves are empty. People fighting over the last of something. Do you want to be in that? Or do you want to be safe at home with your family and your 2 weeks, a month, 3 months of food and water? So my recommendation to everybody, and please share this with people, you know, or even if you don't share this video, at least have this conversation with your friends, your family, your loved ones. Everybody, every single family needs to have at least 2 weeks of food and water stored. Because if there is a problem in the supply chain, or there's a localized disaster, whatever that may be, having 2 weeks of food and water can really, really it can be the thing that bridges the gap between you and when help arrives. Now, if you have 3 months or more stocked up, you may not even need that help when it arrives. When the FEMA trucks roll in, you don't even need to be dependent on them, right? But even just bridging that gap between the disaster and when the FEMA trucks roll in, that gap alone could be 2 weeks. Even if you're going to totally depend on the government to save you, which I don't recommend, just 2 weeks may be just enough to get you to that. Now, if you can store a month, 3 months, a year, or more of food and water, or have a way of reliably replenishing your supply without depending on handouts and disaster relief, not only can you be less dependent on government and less dependent on those things coming, which you don't know when they're going to come or what they're going to look like when they get there, but you also can avoid being a strain on the system. So think about this. You have a disaster in your area. Everybody loses power, loses water. There's disruption of the supply chain. People can't get food. Let's say it takes a week for the FEMA trucks to roll in with relief supplies. And let's say you have a month of food and water. What you can say is, you know what? When those FEMA trucks roll in, I'm not going to go out there. I'm not going to go out there and get food and water from them because I have enough. And you can allow those who do need it badly, who didn't have the stuff stocked up, they can go get food and water from FEMA. And there's going to be more to go around. So you're actually helping your neighbor by making sure that you and your family are prepared, because now you're not waiting in line with them, right? You get out of the line and there's more food and water for those who need it most. So being prepared is not just helping you, it's actually also helping your community. The more people who are prepared, the less strain there is on those relief supplies when they do come in. So if we are going to see a disaster this winter, winter of 2021, 2022, be prepared. Don't get caught by surprise. Don't get to that point where the shelves are empty, your power's off, your water's off, and you go, oh man, I should have listened. I should have been prepared. Do it now. Or if you're in Texas right now and you're like, we're still kind of recovering, maybe not now, maybe in a week, wait a week, right? But stock up. There are really good options for food buckets. There are really good options for water storage out there. Do your research, find the thing that makes sense for you, but have a supply at least 2 weeks, if not a month or more. I know that when this disaster hit, when this storm hit, my parents and I took a good hard look at what the gaps were in our preparedness. And there were gaps, there were significant gaps. And we're going to fix those. We're going to fill those gaps between now and next winter. In fact, I mean, the sooner the better. We're looking at options for increasing our ability to grow some of our own food. Not necessarily growing all our own food. We're not quite at that level yet. We're not homesteaders. Although, if you are able to homestead, if that's something that's feasible for you and you're interested in that, please go for it because it really is an awesome option. We're not there. We're not homesteaders. We're not going to be totally self-sufficient. We're not trying to be. We're at least trying to make sure that we have the supplies. My husband and I, my parents, my family, that we have the supplies that if another disaster hits, we are not lining up for food and water with everybody else. We are able to stay home, stay safe, and take care of ourselves. And again, reduce the strain on those systems that are trying to help people. So when the FEMA trucks roll in, those who need the supplies can go get them, and the rest of us can stay home. And you think about it that way, it reduces the strain, it reduces the number of people who need help, and it makes it easier to help those most in need, those most vulnerable. Now, people have told me, oh, well, it's really expensive to be prepared. Not necessarily. Some of these food buckets are actually fairly inexpensive when you break it down to per serving or per meal, but that still does require you to have some extra cash on hand. And there are people who live paycheck to paycheck, and I understand that. So if you're somebody who's really on a budget, there's a couple of things you can do. Number one, if you have space, if you have a backyard, or even if you just have a patio, start growing some of your own food. That can be really, really inexpensive. In some cases, free. There are some cases where you can get free supplies to garden, and you just kind of look that up in your area. And there may be things where you can go. In some cities have municipal systems where you can actually go and get kind of junk that people throw away. And there's sometimes where it's like, hey, I found a flower pot. I found a old crate that can be filled with dirt and used to grow things. You know, there's different ways that you can use free resources. There's also a lot of times nonprofits that will provide free resources for people who want to garden because they're actually trying to promote that. If you find a community garden in your area, that can be a really inexpensive way to start gardening if you don't have space at home. So those are some good things. Growing some of your own food can be really good. Also, just when you go to the grocery store, get an extra can of something that's non-perishable. An extra can of chili, an extra can of vegetables, right? Check the date on it, make sure it's not going to go, that the sell by date is like a couple years out because those things usually are like years. Just grab an extra can or two and over time slowly build up your stores. And same thing with water. Get an extra, those gallon jugs of water. They're pretty inexpensive. Grab an extra one of those every time you go to the store. It might be $1. Spend an extra $1 and get one of those gallon-sized jugs and stock up that water in your home. Over time, start using some of that water. You kind of do want to rotate it through. You don't want to let it sit for too long, so you can kind of rotate it through once you have a good stock built up. But have some water stocked up. Have some food stocked up. The more buffer that you have, the better you survive that disaster. And if you really want to be cheap, let's say you're in the situation where you have more time than money, like maybe you're not working, and so you don't have a lot of money, but you do have time. It can be really inexpensive to can your own produce. Buying fresh produce when it's in season where it's cheaper when it's in season in your local area, canning it and storing it for those times when it's out of season and it's more expensive. So those are some really good things that you can do to kind of uh, get yourself more prepared. So if you have questions about any of this, please feel free to comment and or message me on Tumblr. I'm happy to answer questions about this, but I really want to encourage people to be more prepared. I'll talk more about this in upcoming live streams and videos. I may do some like little shorter segments on food preparation or like food preservation or on food storage or on being prepared. But just be thinking through these things, especially if you're in Texas or you're in a place that was affected by these storms. Think about these things and how could you have been more prepared? Even if you were super prepared, right? How could you have been more prepared? What were things that you were still missing? What can we do between now and the next crisis, whatever that may be? How can we be a little bit more prepared? So thank you guys for watching. I'll be back next Saturday. I'll be back home. Okay, I'm going home tonight. So next Saturday, I'll be back in my normal location. I'll see y'all next week. Stay safe, stay warm, and be prepared.